Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Scott Lotus, and I'm President and Executive Director of the Center for Railroad Photography and Art. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, The Railroad and the Art of Place, with David Kahler. Uh, we're doing a series of these online back to March when we all but we're really pleased with the opportunities we have to share more of our work with you online, and we really thank all of you for tuning in tonight. We'll be posting this presentation on our YouTube channel. You can find all of our past presentations there as well at youtube.com/railphotoart. We have, counting all of our conference presentations on our YouTube channel, as well as some past content as well, all there free for viewing. And we'll be posting this one either later this week or certainly by early next week. So be sure to check out our YouTube channel for that and for all of our past presentations. We're in the process of putting some plans in place for some great presentations at the winter into the new year. Look for information about those on our website, railphoto-art.org. You can also click on our social media links there and to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and we'll post updates there about our upcoming events. One of those that I can announce, at least the date for it, February 23rd, we're going to be partnering with the Christopher Transportation Museum up in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, on a presentation about their extensive collection of railroad dining car china, probably the largest private collection of dining car china in the world. Some really spectacular pieces, and their curator is going to walk us through some of her favorites. That's going to be February 23rd. That's a Tuesday night. Make sure to mark your calendar for that one. We'll have some others before that as well that we'll be announcing in the coming weeks too, but that should be a good one to hopefully get us through the cold months. Tonight's presentation is about the railroad and the art of place, and it's going to be presented to you by David Kahler. David is the vice chairman of the Center's board of directors, and he is our longest serving director, having joined our board back in 2000. During the past 20 years, David has helped shepherd the center through a remarkable period of growth. It's thanks in great part to his institutional leadership and that of everyone on our volunteer board of directors that we've been able to build upon and keep moving forward in the years ahead. David grew up fascinated by steam locomotives, dating back to his childhood, watching Pennsylvania steam locomotives on their Elmira branch. Photography was an early interest as well, and he has combined these into a lifelong pursuit that has taken him to a lot of interesting places. But the one we're going to be talking about tonight is a place that's very dear to my heart, the coalfields of West Virginia, very close to where I grew up. And in the 1980s, David saw an exhibition of Winston Link's photographs, and he was so taken by them, even though the steam locomotives were gone by then, he knew he needed to go what was left of that railroad landscape. Over the period of 6 years in the 1990s, he and his wife Cynthia made week-long trips every year in February, in the dead of winter, to appreciate that raw, gritty art of place in the West Virginia coalfields. Just a few years ago, David came to us with this body of work. We had a presentation about it at our conference, an article in our journal, and we ended up publishing a book about it called The Railroad and the Art of Place. And David's going to be sharing selections of this and talking about his philosophy in this book with you today. If you'd like a copy of this book, they are still available. They are also on our website. Again, that is railphoto-art.org. And if you just add /Kahler, Kahler, that will take you directly to the page where you can purchase the book, about $60 plus shipping. It's a lovely book, illustrated, all taken the traditional way, using a Leica 35mm film camera, T-Max film, to really capture the grit and just the sense of that wintertime raw mountain feeling of West Virginia coal mining railroads. I don't want to delay too much longer. David's going to be the one to tell you all about this tonight. A little bit more about David, though. He went to school and became an architect and spent most of his career in the city of Milwaukee with the practice he helped found, Kahler Slater, still one of the most prestigious architecture firms in Milwaukee. Their projects have included restoration of the state capitol and the University of Wisconsin's Red Gym in Madison, a major addition to the Milwaukee Art Museum. Milwaukee, there's that beautiful cable stayed bridge right outside of it. That was one of Kahler Slater's projects. David did the lighting for that, as well as the entire lighting plan for the city of Milwaukee. David's someone who knows art. He spent his entire life around art, working around art and architecture, learning from other artists, going all the way back. So when David says he knows art when he sees it, you can take that to the bank. It's really our pleasure to have David be able to share this work with you tonight. Without further ado, I will turn it over to David Kahler. David, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Scott, for the warm introduction. You have been a true friend of mine for many a moon. The Center for Railroad Photography and Art is extremely fortunate to have you on board as president and executive director. Another long-term dear friend, Jeff Browse, who is a fellow director, helped me make tonight's presentation 5 years ago at our annual meeting at Lake Forest College. A year later, excuse me, Jeff and his talented wife, Wendy Burton, served as editors and designers of my railroad photography book, The Railroad and the Art of Place. Thankfully, Jeff took it upon himself to edit 1,200 of my photographs that I had taken over a 6-year period in the coalfields of West Virginia, beginning 28 years earlier. He and Wendy are working with me again on another center for the Railroad Photography and Art book, the book, The Railroad and the Art of Place, an anthology that we hope to have printed early 2021. It will contain 352 pages. For some reason, I don't have my, I lost my.
You're looking for your notes?
No, I lost my side. What happened to it? Oh, there it is. Okay.
Hey, David.
Yes.
Can I jump back in? I forgot to do my housekeeping notes about Webex.
Okay.
Sorry about that. And we were just talking about them a few minutes ago.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, my apologies. Well, just for everyone joining us tonight, a couple of housekeeping notes about Webex. There's some options to change how you see the display. You can access that by rolling your mouse over the main window, and you'll see a circular button in the upper right-hand corner of that main window. You can use that to cycle through a few different display options. If you go to the one that's called the floating panel view, that will take you into essentially a full screen option. And that will then also give you the option of you can cycle back and forth between having the speaker as the main window or having the presentation as the main window. Within that little window of thumbnail video views, you can see one that has arrows pointing in opposite diagonal directions. You can use that to toggle back and forth, whether the speakers or the slideshow is then the main part of the window. And there's a whole bunch of different views in there. You can cycle through them to see all of the options. As attendees, you don't have access to your camera or your microphone. You're not able to unmute or turn those on. We have 150 people logged in tonight, so that's why we keep that turned off. But you can certainly participate using both the chat function and the Q&A function. Those appear in the bottom right-hand corner of your window. If you don't see them immediately, there's a couple of oval-sized buttons at the lower right where you can click on chat and Q&A to bring those up. We'll be happy to take questions at the end. Please send those to us using the Q&A feature. Haley and I will be monitoring that, and we can then relay your questions to David. If you have comments or anything else you want to say, please try to put those into the chat feature. It's really helpful to us if you can make sure to put questions into the Q&A. That way we can monitor all the questions and make sure they get asked at the end. So that's all I have for the housekeeping. David, thanks for the interruption, and I'll turn it back over to you now.
Onward now to the railroad. To the railroad and the art of place.
Without further ado.
Yeah, Blake is beautiful. My February 1992 photograph tells it all. Black and white photography, 40 shades of black, and railroad equipment scattered along the Norfolk Southern pastoral right-of-way in Nolan, West Virginia. I could not resist capturing the gloominess of this seemingly unremarkable landscape that includes a fuel tank earmarked with graffiti, signal masts, rail sections, and a tool house under dark, heavy, leaden skies. As a lifelong rail fan, this was an early attempt on my part to capture the art of place. My intuition told me that this special place could vanish sooner rather than later. At the time, Senator Byrd was beating the drums in Washington to upgrade the state's highway system to provide better access to recreational and economic growth opportunities. Alas, several years later, my prediction turned into reality. Route 52 was realigned, houses torn down, and this view was destroyed under the guise of creative destruction. You may be wondering why I took this grim photo. Watching trains in evocative pastoral settings has always fascinated me, much like the day in Leominster, Massachusetts, when I was 5 years old. I was walking along a meandering path in a field of lush green grass and white birch trees when I stumbled upon an old rusty shell of a toy locomotive that a child could mount and steer with a T-shaped handlebar. This happy discovery was my first encounter with the eternal clash between industry and nature. Better said by Leo Marx in his iconic book, The Machine in the Garden, written in 1964. Recently, after reading Marx's book, I felt compelled to consider his thesis as one of the primary themes of my presentation, namely the dichotomy of technology and the pastoral ideal in America. The analogy is abundantly clear. The train is the machine and West Virginia is the garden. It should come as no surprise that the name Virginia in West Virginia was originally derived from the adjective virgin, in this case, virgin territory. As early as the 17th century, Europeans thought of the Virginia colony as a garden in the developing New World. With the inception of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, industry became an intrusive element in the natural environment. Industrial decay eventually became the byproduct of this revolution. Such a phenomenon could be accepted as a negative sign of progress, or it could be considered in a more positive light as a potential work of art. Personally, I was inclined to follow the latter path. In many ways, my 6-year photographic journey along the Pokey can be aptly described in a quotation made by Flannery O'Connor, a favorite Southern writer of mine, who said, "The action of grace and territory held largely by the devil." In other words, creating poetry out of an era of heavy industrialization became an obsession. Let's see here. All right. Thanks to Jeff Browse, I realized a year ago that I was not the only one who harbored this perception of industrial decay as an opportunity for artful expression. He introduced me to two avant-garde photographers, namely Lee Friedlander and Louis Baltz, who grappled with the concept of the machine in the garden. See Friedlander's book, Factory Valleys, 1982, and the Albertina Museum Catalog, 2013, for Louis Baltz, both of whom photographed industrial waste. Let me just get this thing a minute. And shared my interest in the world of the used and discarded. Rusty toys and backyards filled with refuse can tell you tales about a place and its culture. Before I take you to Norfolk Southern's Pocahontas District, let me digress for a moment and return to my roots. My life began in 1937 in Smoky, Baltimore, where coal-burning trains and residential furnaces filled the air. From that point going forward, I was predestined to love the smell of coal smoke. My mother hated it. As soon as her labor pains began, she asked my father to drive her back to their former hospital in Harrisburg, where I could be delivered. She must have forgotten that Harrisburg was just as smoky as Baltimore because it was a major rail center for the Pennsylvania and Reading railroads, while steel mills in the adjacent town of Steelton bathed the city with coal smoke and industrial odors 365 days a year. Fortuitously, the combination of coal smoke, smelter smoke, and industrial decay became my lodestar throughout life. Strange, but bleak can be beautiful. I know that for most of you in the audience today, that it was probably your father or your favorite uncle that got you interested in trains, but I had a completely different experience and credit many women directly and indirectly for steering me toward the railroad. For instance, mothers today give their babies pacifiers to keep them from crying. To eliminate my crying, my mother propped me up in the baby carriage, parked on the porch overlooking a street where streetcars clattered by our row house. I was totally amused day after day. Later, I graduated to playing with rubber trains and eventually lives and Lionel train sets. My mother must have been clairvoyant. She didn't throw me to the dogs, she threw me to the trains. She was the first of 6 women to whom I owe a debt of gratitude. They were part of a common thread that ran through my life. Each played a role in my development as an architect and amateur railroad photographer. In 1943, my family moved from Leominster, Massachusetts to pastoral Chadsford, Pennsylvania. Chadsford was 10 miles from Wilmington, Delaware, where my father worked for the DuPont Company. My closest boyhood friend was the grandson of N.C. Wyeth, the painter, and the nephew of Andy Wyeth. We attended the same grade school located along the Brandywine River, where the British whipped our Continental Army. Between the river and our school's playfield, the colorful Wilmington and Northern branch of the Reading Railroad ran between Coatesville, Pennsylvania, and Wilmington, Delaware. Every day, freight trains led by double-headed camelback steam locomotives pounded the rails and our pennies as they made their way through bucolic fields and forests owned by the DuPont heirs. My friend and I played with Lionel trains in his playroom built within a barn used as a studio by his father, who was an artist brought in by his father-in-law, N.C. Wyeth, to compete with his son, Andy Wyeth. The 4 walls of the playroom were covered with original oil paintings by N.C. Wyeth. This unique community of artists and venue had a profound influence on me. It was the first of many experiences that awakened my interest in art. From 1943 to 1953, my father drove my mother, younger brother, and me to visit my grandparents in Harrisburg at least once a month. My grandfather worked as a brakeman riding down the hump atop boxcars for 50 years in the Reading Railroad's Rutherford yards outside of Harrisburg. In the summer of 1951, I goaded my grandfather into taking me to his workplace to photograph trains with my Aunt Ethel's Kodak box camera using 120 film. She lived with my grandparents and was the second woman who influenced me and was kind enough to trust me with her camera. These 2 photos that you're going to see, one of the massive Rutherford coaling tower and the ready tracks for the locomotives, were my first encounters with photography. My grandfather assured me that the steam locomotive was here to stay forever. According to him, steam engines were more gentle with passenger cars when it came to switching duties. During the summer of 1957, I worked in architectural school. I worked as an architectural apprentice in an architect's office located on the 2nd floor of a 2-story building by a narrow city street in Elmira, New York, and from an elevated railroad viaduct that featured Pennsylvania Railroad 280s passing in front of my desk daily, every couple of hours. It's a damn difficult duty, to say the least. This leg of the Pennsy system was connected to the legendary Southport yard of the Elmira branch that was immortalized by Phil Hastings and Jim Shaughnessy in the 1950s. At the time, I was not aware of these pioneers in railroad photography until many years later. Before the summer was over, I cajoled my father into letting me borrow his car to visit the Southport yards after work in August. He was generous enough to loan me his Kodak Brownie Special 6 16 camera loaded with 120 Kodak film. More pictures of the Southport yards. There's a 280 inside the roundhouse. The Elmira branch ran between Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and Sodas Point, New York. The renowned Kendall Tower can be seen in the distance. Little did I realize at the time that steam was in its twilight years on the Pennsy, or let's say that I simply didn't want to admit it. In 2 more months, all locomotive fires on the Pennsy were dead. After all, why should I worry? My grandfather said that steam would be here forever. These photos were the last of the last, yet they were prescient in another way. They uncovered my intuitive interest in composition early on. That autumn, I returned in my sophomore year to architectural school. Our basic design class was taken out to the country to do plein air watercolor painting. As you can see in my painting, I headed for a string of New York Central hopper cars and a signal mast. And there was a gandy dancer working on the tracks, however. After I completed the painting, I came to a crossroads. Do I paint or do I become an architect? It was a difficult decision to make. I took the financially safer route, but knew down deep inside that I still had a need to express myself as an artist. Fortunately, railroad photography would prove to be an artistic outlet down the line. My design professor, Martha McGavick, was the third woman in the common thread. While in graduate school at Princeton in the spring of 1962, I attended a panel discussion that featured Louise Nevelson, a world-renowned sculptor. She designed and built this 12-foot-high luminous Zag Knight. This is evidently in the permanent exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum. The small auditorium we were sitting in was hot in the high 90s with no air conditioning. An impertinent graduate student asked her to tell the assembled group of students what an artist needed to do to become successful. Oh, I think that he asked that question. Nevelson was a tough cookie, and sitting up front on an elevated stage behind a long open table with her nylon stockings rolled down like donuts below her knees for cooling, and holding a smoking cigarette between her fingers high above her head, she sardonically exclaimed, "Son, you either have it or you don't." To this day, I never forgot her retort. She gave me more confidence to pursue my artistic cravings wherever they might take me. She was woman number 4. Many years later, in 1990 to be exact, I was reading a Sunday edition of the New York Times and was blown away when I spotted a sensational photograph of a Norfolk Western Y6 locomotive storming down Main Street in North Fork, West Virginia, by Winston Link. It was a life-changing experience. Who was this man, and why did he photograph black steam engines at night in the 1950s? I had to find out. This was a seminal moment. I immediately decided that I had to get myself down to West Virginia as soon as possible to photograph the remains of the day in the rapidly changing world of railroading. Up until this time, it was difficult for me to accept the fact that diesel locomotives were here to stay. However, I could make an exception. The newly formed Norfolk Southern conglomerate that absorbed the Norfolk and Western Railroad and the Southern Railway had black diesel locomotives as well as black vintage hopper cars. After 2 years of procrastination, I finally got my act together. In the middle of February 1992, I decided to skip a trip to New Mexico to see some friends and plan to drive with my wife, Cynthia, to Williamson, West Virginia, armed with my Leica M6 camera, a 28-millimeter lens, and 400 ASA T-Max black and white film. And why not black and white film? After all, black locomotives and rolling stock wanted to be photographed in black and white format during the middle of winter when the trees were bare and the weather conditions stark. I anticipated that photographing trains in the hills and hollers of West Virginia was going to be analogous to photographing objects in a box. The walls of the box would be defined on all 4 sides by mountains. The lid would be the sky burdened with heavy cloud cover, and the bottom would be the craggy ground plane. As a result, I hope to find a sense of intimacy there, unlike the box without walls effect found in the Midwest. The net result was an increased amount of visual stimuli. I was not disappointed. The original plan was to make this a one-week affair. I didn't think that I could get away with anything longer than that with my normally patient wife, who was an accomplished artist who majored in abstract watercolors. Surprise! She was a good sport and accompanied me on 6 one-week visits during February 1992 through 1997. She was woman number 5. Why did I select Williamson as my base for operations? Well, primarily because it was the largest community with a hotel located on the main line in Norfolk Southern, and the fact that it was a major railhead that served as the nexus between the Canova and Pocahontas districts. According to my research, the Pocahontas district was blessed with rail yards, coaling towers, 20 tunnels, heavy train activity, bridges, and a plethora of heavily forested hills and hollers. Everything a model railroader dreamed about. Unlike old Winston Link, who photographed night trains in several contiguous states, I chose to concentrate upon a narrow 140-mile strip of territory along the West Virginia-Kentucky border. My time was limited. I had to see more with less if I wanted to capture the art of place and at the same time maintain my practice of architecture. Two noted artists who adopted a similar strategy were Michael Flanagan, a gifted artist who illustrated and wrote the novel Stations. Flanagan focused on his imaginary Buffalo and Shenandoah Railroad in the tiny county of Potomac of Virginia, while the other, William Faulkner, my favorite Southern writer, created the little county of Yoknapatawpha in Mississippi that became the setting for two of his post-Civil War novels, The Sound and the Fury and Absalom, Absalom. Both artists packed a lot of action into small parcels of real estate. My original objective was to simply photograph trains. However, this proved to be short-sighted. Gradually, my objective morphed into a quest to capture the art of place along the line of the Norfolk Southern Railroad's Pocahontas district in West Virginia. I wanted to do straight photography without being unduly picturesque or documentary. I only wanted to create highly evocative photographs that framed the conflict between the products of industry and their unnatural alliance with the pastoral landscape. Each time that I returned to this territory, I had discovered new opportunities for artistic expression. After 2 years of procrastination, I finally got my act together in the middle of February 1992. I decided to skip a trip to Mexico and drive. I think I just covered that. Okay. On the way to Williamson from Milwaukee, I usually drove on the Kentucky side along the Ohio River, thereby giving myself the opportunity to observe railroad activity on the CSX right away before I hit the main line of the Norfolk Southern at Canova. I thought of it as a warm-up period before a game. It gave me the opportunity to take myself out of my daily professional routine and put me into a fresh frame of mind before photographing trains in West Virginia. The first stop was the former Russell Yards of the C&O Railroad. As can be seen here, the yard still hosted much activity. Unfortunately, the roundhouse and the coaling facilities were no more. The main line was busy, the rails were shiny. The silhouette of the imposing structure in the foreground became an anchoring device in the composition that helped convey the essence of this immense rail yard. Further south, in the first of two photographs, you can see the two blast furnaces at the steel mill in Ashland, Kentucky. Unfortunately, now only one blast furnace is standing. In the second photograph here, a CSX is shown, a train is fighting its way through the snow on the main line. The next two photographs were taken in the rain at Catlettsburg. As you can surmise, climatic conditions were beginning to play a significant role in my photography. Visual clutter is rich in density here, along with the perilous low overhead clearance below the girder bridge. The Canova Yard complex was the first stop in West Virginia. I didn't realize it at the time, but thanks again to Jeff Browse, I learned that a new important movement in American photography that began in the 1970s and early 80s had been spearheaded by the likes of Louis Baltz, who photographed industrial detritus at San Quentin Point in 1977. Unconsciously, I was mimicking his topographical take. Need I remind you again, I too like to photograph trash. The culvert, a simple element in the picture frame, became for me a crucial place marker and a place marker in the garden. It had been said that one man's trash is another man's treasure. Here in the yards, Further down the line, driving south on Route 52, I always stop to pay my respects to the imposing concrete coaling tower that straddles the Norfolk Southern Main Line in Pritchard, West Virginia. Too large to be torn down without disrupting traffic, this majestic masterwork stands tall to remind us of steam railroading's past. My winter shot highlights the wonderful snow-covered vines that are gradually taking over the tower's bucket enclosure. View looking down the main line. Here are two photos taken along Route 52, both of which clearly demonstrate the dramatic contrast between the machine and the garden. The first picture embraces the diagonal forms of the roadways, slashing their way across the composition to make a memorable statement. The second photograph demonstrates the dramatic moment when industrial might meets nature and turns the event into a work of art. The distinctive railroad sign to the right adds a warning touch while creating a space-time scenario in a fraction of a second. Speaking of industrial detritus, here is Nolan again. Where bleak is beautiful, the following series of photographs emote a sense of loneliness and apprehension. Together, they amplify the bleak realities found in the heart of coal country, USA. They are examples of West Virginia in its work clothes. Nothing is staged, just natural and very evocative. That building looks almost like it's in Venice. And of course, one of the most interesting photographs I've ever taken was this one, this photograph of a train roaring by a vulnerable, apprehensive mother and her children making their way between trucks and locomotives is a stunning example of the sound and the fury associated with the clash of technology with the pastoral. More Nolan. Nolan at 52. When my wife and I finally arrived in Williamson for the first time, we locked onto the Sycamore Inn at 2nd Avenue and Pritchard Street. It was a large three-story shoebox-shaped building supported on one-story high columns to protect the structure from the annual Tug Fork River floods. The only apparent access was by means of a little open exit stair beneath the box. We climbed the stairs that emptied into a tiny, well-appointed room where we found a very pleasant Dagmar sitting behind the desk. It was Sunday morning. You remember the Dagmar bumpers on Cadillacs in the 50s, don't you? I won't explain anymore. I asked for a room facing the railroad's main line below. In a demonstrative tone, Dagmar, she immediately explained that we did not want such a room. It would be too noisy. Even the trainmen, she said, hate the location. After arguing my case for a couple of minutes more, she relented. I said, this is exactly what I wanted. Trains ripping by, blowing their horns 24/7 meant everything to me. The windows opened fully, and I would have an unobstructed view of railroad heaven with an Italian hill town as a backdrop. Who could want anything more? I took the following two photos sometime during the 7 visits. Whoops, what the hell's going on here? Here at a later date, from the same vantage point, my wife and I could watch time changing the landscape before our very eyes. After settling my wife in the room, I headed out to the street to survey the area. Before I reached the intersection at 3rd Avenue and Pritchard, I stopped and wondered, why was I here and what was I going to photograph? This was a new adventure without a plan. When to my left appeared a slow-moving train with a string of black hoppers. Then came the aha moment. The street view was exactly what I had been looking for these past 2 years, an ordinary moment in a railroad context. I realized the significance of capturing an evocative mood in its innocent state of being. That was all that was important to me going forward. This was the transformative discovery that confirmed my quest for the art of place in the railroad world. Capturing the unique qualities of the moment became my reason for being. To me, street vistas, alleys, and backyards can be great resources for artful expression. Here, the true flavor of the place was conveyed by means of the juxtaposition of building mass, a locomotive, and a pastoral background. At the same time, I came to the realization that it was not necessary to have an actual train in the picture. Mere traces of railroad equipment along with street furniture, for example, utility poles, street signs, emergency generators, trash, old tires, street lights, and traffic signals would suffice. Here, the cacophony of street furniture enhances the level of interest in the composition. Meanwhile, the pastoral continues to persist in the background. Here's a good shot of trash in one of the streets. And of course, here's a backyard detritus. You can tell many tales. You can see the train coming in, coming near the back side of this house with all of the detritus spread around the backyard. And looking up one of the streets of this hill town, the views of the busy mainline tracks leading to the rail yards caught my attention. In 1992, before we became so paranoid about security, I was able to ramble anywhere along the tracks and set my own vantage points without worrying about the law breathing down my neck. The main line was dressed with piles of ballast, retired signal masts, abandoned sidings, tie piles, and trails of engine oil drippings. Collectively, they provided an ideal platform for taking artful photographs in the midst of heavy-duty railroad activity. The vast Williamson yards changed every year. Tracks were either altered or removed, and the amount of coal traffic fluctuated depending upon the winter's demands. The first shot was taken around dusk during a rain event. The mood was not to be missed. I pulled over and tried my luck. One day, my luck ran out. I was kicked out of the Williamson yards by a railroad detective. It was embarrassing. It was February 14th, my birthday. I made a promise to myself, never again. When I returned to Milwaukee, I wrote a letter to the president of the railroad and pleaded my case. After I agreed to sign waivers, he relented and gave me a pass the following year. Upon my arrival the following February, the yardmaster said that he would have to accompany me around the yards. I said, hey, wait a minute. I proclaimed, how can one capture the art of place with someone looking over your shoulder? Eventually, he got the point and gave me permission to ride around the yards for more than an hour in the cab of an ST-40-2. Coincidentally, it just so happened that I had a scale O-gauge model of Norfolk Southern ST-40-2 high hood at home sitting on a display shelf. Looking out of the cab. After disembarking from the cab, I was free to wander about the premises. Ironically enough, some of the better pictures were taken from the employees' suspension bridge spanning the yards. And black locomotives still had cabooses. This is an artful example of the level of adjustment that the pastoral had to make to accommodate industrial progress. On a whim, I decided to become an Winston Link for an evening. I set out with camera and tripod and shot this photo using available light and a wild guess about the length of exposure time. Even at night, evidence of the pastoral creeps in when you consider the weeds and brush in the foreground. On a cold morning, I drove over to the yards through snow mixed with rain after downing my daily fill of biscuits and sausage gravy. There I spied two GP-38s preparing to leave the yard. They had orders to cross over the Tug Fork River and pick up hopper cars in the Goody Yard on the Kentucky side of the river before the river swelled to flood stage. It was flood time. I caught a few action shots before the crew left the premises. They're heading towards the river. I hightailed it over the river and patiently waited for the locomotives. Once they arrived, the engineer invited me into the cab where he proceeded to show me magic tricks. What is this? I said to myself. I wanted to see the details of the cab, not the magic tricks. I asked him if he enjoyed railroading, and his answer was a pronounced hell no, and continued on with his show of talent. Through the cab windows, I watched the snow falling softly on the surrounding mountains while the engineer continued to entertain me with his magic tricks. Behind us, I heard the diesel engine's growling sound and noticed the river rising dangerously. This could only happen in a Fellini movie. It was a surreal moment. A day later, the railroad deposited a string of fully loaded hopper cars on that bridge to act as ballast to thwart the impending flood tide. Several miles southwest of Williamson Yards, as the crow flies, was a community called Sprigg. Small as it was, it sported a small golf course that didn't add up considering the town's tiny size and remoteness. The location was significant only because it was the turnout point of the main line for the busy Lobata mine branch. The twin bores of the Hatfield Tunnels can be seen barely beyond the two truss bridges. This is the Lobata mine site itself. And of course, the roads were pretty slippery, slick. But I caught sight of two GP-38s, two slugs, and a cabin car going back to the main line. On the other side of the mountain chain was the site of the murderous fights between miners and management that took place in the town of Matewan about May 19th, 1920. Surprisingly, the commercial building stock was still in relatively good condition in spite of its long and fractious reputation for social turbulence. Off the mainline curve at Matewan, one can look up the lonely branch line leading to Red Jacket. One of my favorite techniques in composing a composition was to include the utility poles that lend a sense of scale and again produce a space-time relationship between the viewer and the backdrop. The ghosts of the Hatfield and McCoy family feuds, 1863 through 1891, continued to haunt this quaint area. Driving further east on Route 52, we came to the town of Justice. Two C-39-8s were perched on a series of high girder bridges over the highway. This photograph that included the guy in his pickup trying to sell some of his used yard implements under the bridge was a rare moment when happenstance begets art. The elevated track with train exerting its will over the pastoral only compounded the drama of the event. The poor guy trying to sell I don't know whether it was a little snow plow or whether it was a lawnmower, but obviously if he could sell it, he'd have some money to eat, and it would be a good move for him. This photograph taken below the underside of the bridge at that location is an abstract construct that appealed to me. That brings to mind Walker Evans' Brooklyn Bridge photograph made in 1929 in New York. Yeager, the quintessential town for rail fans, enjoying a tremendous amount of railroad activity throughout the first half of the 20th century. In my mind, it ranked at the top of the list in terms of capturing the art of place. This was a railroader's railroad town. It was built at a fork in the Tug Fork River, where three narrow hollers merged together in the middle of a dense cluster of mountains. The fabric of the town was riddled with railroad tracks, including a Y that could be used for turning huge Y6 compound locomotives. Originally, the rail yard was enhanced with a coaling tower, water plugs, engine house, and extensive coal marshaling yards. Today, the only remaining clues left of its former self are the abandoned coaling tower and the ruins of a once proud community. Here, a minor whistle sign becomes a major design element in this lonely setting. It works as an anchoring device that articulates space in the image. An approaching train can be seen in the distance. The constant threat of flooding forced the town of Yeager to turn its back on the river. Only a few forlorn balconies hanging off the rear of an apartment building took advantage of the view. This was no San Antonio river walk. The town in its prime offered everything from soup to nuts as a vibrant commercial center in the middle of West Virginia's pastoral outback. Before it went bust, I was able to photograph the town and its rail yards often. More importantly, my predecessors, Winston Link and Bruce Meyer, were able to record its essence with their cameras when steam ruled the rails back in the 1950s. Here's a shot of the Y, another shot. Back towards the yards, gonna have a break. Here you can see the trash in the coaling tower. I enjoy this shot. It's an interesting composition of complex parts. Here you can see a string of diesels moving and locomotives moving underneath the coaling tower or through the coaling tower. More yard work. Another try at night photography at the same coaling tower, as well as this old Norfolk Western caboose. Beyond Yeager on Route 52, there's an engaging view of an abandoned mine run off the main line. The bridge and its abutments form an interesting geometry. In the foreground, rails are gone. Next stop, east of this last shot of Yeager, in 1992, I found the remains of the projection booth of the renowned movie drive-in theater that Winston Link immortalized in his iconic photograph of the hotshot Eastbound. When I returned in 1997, there were no traces of the booth or the parking area. This photograph was taken from about the same vantage point that Link originally used. This is Sandy Hook Road that formerly provided access to the Link's drive-in theater. Continuing on to Rotterfield via Route 52, I was able to stop the car and photograph a perfect manifestation of the machine in the garden. After jumping out of the car, I could hear the rumble and the roar of diesel engines fast approaching in the distance. Within a couple of minutes, a long caravan of black hopper cars and 3 locomotives streaked by and penetrated a tunnel portal located above and behind this modest residence, surrounded with a neatly groomed yard embellished with plastic animals and a whirligig. After all the excitement died down, we reached the west end of Rotterfield Tunnel. After experiencing another clash between power and the pastoral, I expected that anything going forward would be anticlimactic, and so it was to a certain extent, in spite of the fact that this site was considered to be an ideal place to watch the steady flow of trains. Turning off the Davie-Rotterfield Road, Route 7, 2 miles south of Capels, a coal train blasts out of a portal on a bridge built over the Tug Fork River, another testimonial to man's eternal struggle with Mother Nature. As the train flashes by in a northward direction, it approaches the abandoned coaling tower at Farm/Cables, where pusher locomotives were refueled in the steam age before attacking the steep gradient behind me. A mile and a half north of Farm on the east side of Route 7 is the company town of Capels, where white and black coal mining families resided and worked together. As in most small communities in the mountains, there were several small houses of worship built in close proximity within a holler. Above and beyond the houses of worship are a series of indigenous housing units clinging to a hillside. My photographs here are all part of a mosaic that attests to the fact that the art of place can be found in the humblest of locations. Little did I know that in 1938, Marion Post Walcott, a noted American photographer who worked for the Farm Security Administration, photographed Capels extensively. Many of her photographs, and this is one of them, that were taken on or near this road can be considered bona fide works of art. Before driving east to Welch, we deviated from our plan and took a day drive to Logan, where I was pleasantly surprised to find the decaying remains of the former C&O C&O's Peach Creek yards and community. CSX, the new game in town, had retained several of the important steam locomotive landmarks, such as the coaling tower and the turntable in the 1990s. This railhead was once one of the busiest centers of activities on the former Chesapeake in Ohio. It serviced an extensive network of mine runs that covered a very large territory in this part of West Virginia. At the same time, Peach Creek was the site of massive coal marshaling yards. The railroaders who worked these yards lived in fairly well-maintained company housing next to the tracks before the coal market and steam railroading declined. As can be observed, one of the homes succumbed to a fire event. Now, 20 years later, if you were to visit this place, you would be disappointed to learn that all of the significant railroad structures have been removed except for the yard office, according to Google Earth. The most remote outpost that we visited one day was Welch. The visit was short. Before we left town, I noticed the mainline tracks extending from a tunnel and crossing over the street next to a dark, ancient, mixed-use building, an apartment building. The brick exterior was seasoned with a heavy layer of coal soot. It looked like the perfect noir movie set made in the 40s. I could not resist. I parked the car and waited patiently for an hour and a half for that crucial moment when a train would blast out of the tunnel. No luck, no Humphrey Bogart, no Lauren Bacall. Time to go back to Williamson. While returning to Williamson after a productive foray, I spied an abandoned coal bunker. To say the least, it was a machine left to die in its garden. To this day, I can't remember the exact location. In my eyes, it was a beautiful piece of Americana that needed to be recorded for posterity. In many ways, it was an important historical marker that outlived its original purpose, yet increased its value as an artifact. In my mind, this abandoned coal bunker was no less important than the coal bunkers photographed by Hela and Bern Beecher in Germany, 1967 through 1998. They photographed the best examples of industrial archaeology in Europe and the United States. They took a very objective approach whereby they photographed a series of coal bunkers from the same elevated viewpoint, utilized the same natural lighting conditions, and arranged them into a grid of 12 images as a typology. Each image is cropped to the extent that context is virtually eliminated. There's no sense of place here. Each coal bunker is similar but different nevertheless. One image is not enough to stand on its own as a work of art, but must be appreciated as an essential part of a larger typological ensemble. By the way, I consider Hela as woman number 6 of the common thread that influenced my journey. After her husband had passed away, she was recorded discussing her work with an art critic on the internet. Her artistic accomplishments and intellectual prowess won me over. She and her husband provided me with a baseline that I could work against for the purpose of clarifying and understanding my own approach to photography. The Beecher's approach was diametrically opposed to my intentions. Please don't get me wrong. I love their work. I simply prefer to be more subjective. I have an intuitive need to stress the art of place. Context is an essential factor when I want to capture a specific mood. Black and white format is the only medium for me when it pertains to evocative railroad photography, in spite of the fact that the black and white format, by its very nature, elevates the image into an objective sphere, thereby avoiding the distractions inherent in color photography. Caspar David Friedrich, 1774 to 1840, considered as the greatest painter of the Romantic movement in Germany, once said, "The painter depicts not what he sees before him, but what he sees within him." I agree with this philosophical disposition. Before I click the camera shutter, I visualize each frame as a potential work of art in itself. The last thing I want to do is to rely on computer technology for corrective surgery. Black and white format gives me freedom through limitations. Up front, it provides me with a simple yet clear avenue towards achieving the art of place without distraction. It allows me to focus more on form, line, and light. My modus operandi is working with the concept of space, time, and railroads. Black and white photography provides me with an adequate amount of latitude to control multiple layers of gray tones and grittiness while harnessing an acceptable level of detail under available light. In conclusion, I learned that the innate properties of black and white film were ideally suited to cope with the vagaries of a diverse climate and geography found in the hills and hollers along the Norfolk Southern's Pocahontas right-of-way. In the middle of February, the days are short, the skies are heavy, and the trains are black. The art of place is there if you look for it. Bleak is beautiful. And that's the end of my presentation.
Oh, thank you, David. That was wonderful. As every time I see this, I learn something new from it. So thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
We are happy to take questions. Again, send those via the Q&A function. I, of course, learned during the presentation while attempting to chat with Oren that sometimes you can send these chats to everyone. So I'll try to be more careful with that in the future. But please do send in any questions you have. We'll be happy to take these. David, one question I have for you is: have you been back since to West Virginia, to those places, since you were photographing there in the 1990s?
No, I have not.
Do you have any desire to?
In some ways, I don't want to. I mean, I'm afraid. You know, I have a second home up in Maine, and I've done a lot of photography of railroads up in Maine, and it's depressing to see what has transpired in the last few years. I think Americans, for some reason, I'm not sure it's only Americans, but it seems to happen an awful lot of times in America. No respect for the past. And instead of saving some of these buildings as monuments to the past, and they're markers, they're just torn down and disappear. And if you go to Google Earth and look at some of these places to see if some of the things are still there, they're gone. So I just don't. I know I saw a video of Jaeger's a couple of years ago, and it didn't even. I mean, everything was vacated, all the stores and everything else, and that was not the way it was when I was there. So it's sort of a sad way to, sad situation when you're looking back at some of these places. You know, you can never resurrect the past.
We do have a question from one of our attendees, Mike Mateka. Mike asks to share more of your interactions with the local population and how that helped to form your concept of the place. Excuse me.
Well, I didn't interact too much with some of the people there, except when I was staying in Williamson at the inn, and instead of eating in the restaurant within the inn, sometimes I would go downtown in Williamson, where the railroaders would congregate and eat breakfast, and I'd listen to some of their conversations. And I do remember one time where a young man came in, and he obviously didn't have much money. Didn't have money to even eat a breakfast, but he normally had some sort of stamp book, and stamps were taken out and applied toward the meal. And this woman who was a waitress refused to serve him because he didn't have any more stamps. And I thought that was pretty cruel. But other than that, I didn't really get a chance to meet many people there.
David Jacobs asks, in your railroad photography journey, have you ever attempted to capture passenger equipment, train stations, or other railroad passenger objects?
No, most of the time I was dealing with freight.
Yeah, certainly in West Virginia, that's all you would find.
Yes. Well, there were passenger trains that ran through Williamson, obviously, at that particular time. It was on the main line, where they came down from Cincinnati and went south. And what was it, the 484?
Oh, sure. Well,
with a bullet nose.
yeah, the J class.
Yeah, J class. That locomotive was not running anymore, but they were still running some passenger trains through there. But the passenger cars, to me, for some reason, I never found them to be quite as interesting to photograph as freight cars.
Why is that, do you think?
Well, I like the geometry that you find in hopper cars or other cars used for transporting freight, as opposed to, I always wondered, when I saw passenger trains, because when I was in Harrisburg and so forth, I saw a lot of passenger trains, because I would go down, when I was visiting my grandmother, I would go down to one of the bridges that went across the Industrial Valley, and in order to get to the station, and I'd look down, and in fact, I did actually see a Pennsylvania K4 Pacific locomotive that it was coupled to 4 or 5 coaches. And I like the Pennsylvania coaches, and so I made my way down to the tracks. I actually went down under the bridge and stood right next to a Pennsylvania K4 that was ready to go across the river, go south. And the K4 at that time, when I was a young teenager, was my favorite locomotive. So I was quite thrilled to see that. And of course, it was a passenger train, but I didn't have my camera.
Sure.
I still can visualize seeing that locomotive and the cab and the fireman and the engineer. But that was it.
Let's see. Alan Shaw asks, David, I really enjoyed your work. The combination of place, your style, and the choice of black and white, and the time you chose to undertake this project adds up to a gorgeous body of work. He also says he notes that you don't include people often in your work, and was that a conscious decision not to include people most of the time?
There weren't many people around. Very few workers. As a matter of fact, the few people that you did see in some of my photographs, basically that was it. I didn't see many people at any time. Not that I was trying to get people in there in the photographs, because sometimes they can be a little distracting. But if I had to do it over again, I'd probably try to have more people in some of the
Well, I mean, that photograph with the mother and her children walking along the side of the road while the traffic whizzes by on one side and the coal train thunders by on the other. I mean, that just so captures the feeling of the moment and the place.
Right. And these were long, that particular place is pretty lonely. There weren't many people around. I didn't see anybody.
Yeah. No, that's been my experience there in a lot of places too.
And if the men were, I know where the men were. The men were underground.
Yeah.
It's like up in Scranton and Wilkes-Barre and places like that. You see a lot of people. You didn't see a lot of people there at that particular time because they were down in the mines.
Yeah.
And that was true here. There were a lot of people were working in the mines. Yeah. They were pretty busy at that particular the time I was there. Yes.
No, that's right. Yeah, the 90s, the coal market was still pretty strong.
Yes.
David Cooper asks, did you have any feeling of when the structures you were photographing that were then common would soon be gone? So, I mean, was there some sense of urgency? Did you feel like these things were going to go away soon? Did you have any sense for that?
Well, being a practicing architect, I saw a lot of buildings that shouldn't have been torn down being torn down. So I was accustomed to that particular activity taking place. And I guess it was a bummer when I think about it, being concerned that some of these things are going to be vacated and not be around. As I said early in my presentation, I wanted to make sure I got down there soon enough because I was afraid that I could see that coal mining was beginning to slip and being replaced by gas and oil and everything else. And I just felt that there was no other alternative there, that these people are going to begin losing their property and also their source of work that they needed in order to exist. And I guess in many respects, I could see the handwriting on the wall, and it worried me that I just wanted to make sure I got there before it was all gone.
Well, it sounds like your background in architecture really helped you appreciate these things and be sure that you weren't taking them for granted.
Exactly.
Kevin Scanlon asks, other than the people you mentioned in your presentation, are there any other photographers or artists who had a significant influence on your viewpoint?
Well, I had a good friend of mine who helped me with the black and white stuff at the very beginning. Is Tom Bamberger, was a photographer in Milwaukee, very good photographer, excellent photographer. And he and I have been friends. And when I decided I was going to go down to West Virginia and do this photography, I didn't have a very good camera at all. I had been to Europe before several times, and I had used a sort of a Canon see-through reflex and things like that. But that's not what I wanted. I wanted to do something good, a good camera. So I couldn't afford a brand new Leica, but I was able to purchase a very good secondhand M6 Leica, and that's what I used on these trips. But just to go out and take these photographs with a fantastic camera wasn't the answer at first. So what am I going to do? So I went down and conferred with Tom Bamberger, the photographer in downtown Milwaukee, and he said, "You use the T-Max film and shoot it at half the ASA. Buy the 400 ASA, but shoot it at 200. It gives you a richer solution, a richer product, and with more detail and everything else." And so I said, okay, and I did that. And so with his help, I was able to do that. And also, for a while, when I brought the film back to Milwaukee on some of these trips, I turned the film over to Tom, and he did the developing of the photographs for me. So
Well,
he would develop the negatives, and then I had to get certain prints and to make. And some of those prints then, of course, ended up in the book that you can buy now. So.
Did you do any darkroom printing of your work?
I didn't do any of that. I didn't have time to do that.
Sure.
I mean, I was building an architectural practice that started at 14 people and built it up to 155.
Oh,
and doing something like that, and then raising 4 kids and a wife and everything else, I didn't have time to do any of that stuff, quite frankly. My business was everything. So
sure. No,
I always figured if I could go to a good lab who could develop the negatives and make some of the test shots and so forth, that would be adequate. I could live with that. I still have the negatives, and I turned the negatives over to Jeff Browse, and who was able then to convert them when we put the book together.
Right. Let's see. Well, David Cooper asked another question, specifically whether you think railroad photography is easier today in the digital age than it was back then.
I believe it is. I don't even use my Leica much anymore because I have my iPhone. I have a R10, and I've been able to take things I would never be able to take with any other kind of camera, quite frankly. And the quality is just as good as a Leica. And also the depth of field is so perfect too, also. And it's just incredible. But the point of having your iPhone with you all the time, you're able then to catch significant opportunities at the drop of the hat, so to speak. Things that you would never be able, you're not going to be carrying your camera around all the time. And it's too heavy and bulky. And the nice thing about my Apple iPhone is that I can catch things that, as I said, I would never be able to do otherwise. I could. And also, the light is very, very, very important to me, and I have been able to catch things with this iPhone that I'd never be able to do even with my other cameras.
Well, it certainly proves the point that the best camera is the one you have.
Exactly. But if you have it with you all the time,
right,
it means something. And so when I did the article, the trackside photographer, about my experience photographing the Northern Main Junction in Maine, when I got off an airplane, I had some free time and went over to the yards, which I had photographed in the past with my Leica. I wanted to see, after a couple of years, what had happened, what had transpired. And I went over there, and I just used the iPhone. That's all I had with me. And they ended up in an article, and those photographs are fantastic. So I'm all for it. And I know some other people I've talked to also who said, wait a minute, I hardly use my expensive cameras anymore either, because I can get the quality that you can get out of some of these cameras with these phones and so forth. They're phenomenal. It's not everybody can do it all the time. You have to know what you're doing. There's no doubt about that. It's not just to happen that way. But being aware and able to capture the quality of light is the most important aspect.
So 2 questions kind of related to security. One about encounters with the railroad police while you were there, and I know you mentioned one of those, but just how common those were and how they were resolved. But then also, Kevin Scanlon mentions that you were kind of in the middle of an opioid crisis in the 1990s there in some of those towns, and if you got any sense of wariness from people seeing a stranger walking around with a camera.
No, and no one ever bothered me. No, and I never was worried either, quite frankly. I just went and did it. And I wasn't really concerned about people who were over drugging or whatever they were doing. No. In fact, I think what happened is I was there just prior to the high point of the opioid crisis. Fortunately, the drugs were not on everybody's mind like it was later.
Right.
Because it's sort of interesting. Kermit, West Virginia, which is near Nolan, happened to be the center for the largest distribution of drugs in the state in the South. Some guy was a druggist, and he had these huge bottles containing all these pills and so forth. And he was, he had a huge business in a little tiny town of Kermit, which is only about maybe 25 or 30 people in it. But it was a drug center of the South.
Brooks Bentz writes in to say that he was an operating department trainee for the Norfolk and Western in the early 1970s, and he worked all through the places that you were photographing. And he mentioned specifically the Chamber of Commerce building in Williamson being constructed entirely out of coal blocks. Did you happen to see that in your travels?
Yes, I was in it. Couldn't believe it at first, but it's all black and it's just coal. It's a coal, big chunks. I think the blocks were probably about the size of a concrete block, if you can imagine that. But that was solid coal. Big chunk. Yep. I can still see it very clearly. I never took a picture of it. And you see, if you were there, you could buy postcards which shows.
Sure.
But I wasn't interested.
So Richard Koenig writes in to say that, like the dichotomy of the machine and the garden, how do you feel about this work in its new form? Now that Jeff has scanned the negatives and shifted your work from silver on film to pixels, does it feel different in this new hybrid form of mixing, and kind of an analog input with digital output?
Actually, if someone asked me to look at some of my work and be able to identify, was it digital or was it the other, I'd say that some people could not tell the difference. There's no way. No way to distinguish the difference. In fact, I found too that when I had a fair, I'm trying to remember what the camera is. It was a digital camera, quite expensive, big, large. And when I went into the back shops of the former Bangor and Rustic Railroad in Maine to do some interior photographs and so forth of the shop areas, I found that the digital camera itself was very limiting. I didn't use my Leica, but I finally had to end up using my iPhone. And then the iPhone shots turned out to be fine because I was able to, even if I had to, on the computer, I could make some adjustments in order to, if need be, for cropping or getting proper contrast. And also the beauty of what I've more recently, by using the iPhone as well as the other camera, which was digital, I could take some of those photographs that I have, and I've got thousands of them, and I have been lately converting them from color to black and white, which you can do very easily. And then you can print them out in black and white, and they're perfect. So I'm very happy with that.
John Reynolds wrote in to ask, with regard to photographing structures and other objects that are no longer being used, did you go to any areas where actual pieces of equipment like locomotives or rolling stock were in the process of being scrapped?
Not in West Virginia. I did see some of that in Maine.
Okay.
But not in West Virginia.
Is that something you photograph very much of in Maine?
Yes, I did photograph a lot. And in fact, I was going to have this new book, and I was going to photograph, again, I like to photograph the remnants of things, rusting pieces, part of the trash, I guess. Bleak is beautiful. And anyway, I did a lot of photography of that, and in the new book that we're producing, I have a section called Derby, Maine, which was the largest rail yards and repair facilities for the Bangor and Rustic Railroad years ago, and it's now been taken over by another railroad. But the point being is that when I photographed it in 2013, there was a lot of equipment trash around, and which I found was very interesting to photograph. And there's a town called Millinock, Maine, which had a big paper mill, and there's a coaling tower there that I photographed quite often, and it had a huge coal shed because of the brutal winters up there, because this is up in the central part of Maine. And in order to keep the coal from freezing before you the tower, or else load up the locomotives, they had to keep it warm in a large structure which had a roof on it and sides and so forth. And that building, I have pictures of it inside and out. And I've just discovered by looking at that particular rail yard right now, and I have a lot of great pictures of it. Now in 2016, most of it's gone.
Hmm.
The turntable was still being in use in 2013. 3 stalls of the roundhouse were still standing. The coal shed was still up. All the hardware on the coaling tower was still in place. And now you can see if you look at an aerial view on Google, all you can see is a shadow cast by the coaling tower, and you can see the turntable is basically not a turntable anymore. It's just a round pit and a lot of junk in it, and the section of the turntable that rotated, it's gone, nothing there. So, and a lot of the tracks you can see are all gone too. So it's just sort of sad to see that type of thing. But on the other hand, the fact that we have an aerial shot of it, you can still remember what was there.
Right. Well, David, I'm going to let Haley jump on. She's got a few more questions that came in to her on the chat function, so I'll let her ask the next few here as we wrap up.
Yeah, Robert Schimmer asks, how do you separate your design sense as an architect from your design displayed in these photographs? From your images, I never would have guessed you were a practicing architect.
Well, if you look at my images, I taught at the college level at the University of Illinois for 3 years. I taught basic design. I was in charge of the basic design program at the School of Architecture. And that's a lot of that. That's very abstract. That's an abstract language, so to speak. And composition was extremely important. And I taught that type of thing to my students because I had 120 students each semester. And out of 120, I had some graduate students to help me do some of the work. But the point being is that composition, light, all that stuff I dealt with all the way through college because that was important to me. And then when I was teaching in college, at the college level, it was important to work to teach the students that. And when I got into my practice of architecture, of course, light and shade, composition were all important key components of my work. And some people, you either have it or you don't have it. And I always felt that I had it and it was important to me. So that's why I got some of these interesting jobs and designed a number of art museums and so forth because I wanted to be close to art. And so I was very close, and there was no separation between myself and art, either in pure art or in architecture. So it all was meshed together as far as I was concerned.
Todd Halamka asks, what suggestions do you have to encourage young railroad photographers beginning their quest for the art of place and the importance of recording present-day moments?
I think you need to. I didn't know much about the background of photography when I got into it. And it was only more recently that I started reading about some of this stuff. But there's a book I highly recommend somebody starting out, and I just gave a copy of it as a birthday present to my 16-year-old granddaughter, who is quite good at photography. And it's called The Ongoing Moment by Jeff Dyer, Geoff, Dyer, Dyer. And that's a very good book that somebody should buy who's starting out in photography to understand what the history of photography has been all about more recently and who the good more recent photographers have been through the first and second half of the 20th century. Very good book. I highly recommend it. And there's another book. Well, there are a lot of other photography books and so forth that are important, but this particular one, I think, is a standout.
Okay. And David Tuttle wonders, did you ever return to any of these locations to improve on previous shots, or did you just move along and with a take what's giving approach?
Well, as I said, what happened to me was I went back there, 6 times, and each time I went back in the same places. I stayed at the same place with my wife, and each time I went back, I had learned more and more about photography and what I was wanting to capture. And I would discover things that I hadn't seen before. And so it wasn't boring. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gone back that many times, quite frankly. And as I said, I kept it to a small area as opposed to trying to photograph all the coal mining areas of West Virginia and Kentucky and so forth. That was not the answer. To me, you focus, and you can find a lot in a small area. As I said, Flanagan did that when he did his book. Andy Wyeth, whom I knew because I was close to that family. If you think about Andy Wyeth, he basically focused on a very small area, Chad's Ford in Maine, and at one place. He wasn't trying to do all of Maine or all of Pennsylvania or anything like that. It was just a specific area. And I think that's extremely important because there's a lot to see in a small area. But most people refuse to see those things. So.
Well, perhaps building off of that sentiment, then Robert Hoffman is wondering if you ever did any photography around Milwaukee, as that's where you were born, and I guess from the center we're curious since we're located in Wisconsin, and your exhibition will be going to Milwaukee next fall. We should note, to the Groman Museum at the MSW campus.
Yeah. Did I do a lot of photography in the area? I mean, I'm not from Milwaukee. I only was there for about 40 years. I'm from the East Coast originally, as I said.
Okay.
Right. But the point being is that, I did go out to, what was the place where John Gruber would go? When you're 83 years old, you don't remember all these places as quickly as you like. Ask me the same question 20 minutes later, and I can answer the question. But what was the name of the area? Near Baraboo, Wisconsin, places like that. I did some railroad photography out there because they had some steam engines and so forth.
North Haven.
But there really wasn't that much in the rest of that area. I should have, when I first moved to Milwaukee in 1965, I should have been smart about it. And if I had a camera, I didn't really have a camera at that time, as I recall. I should have gone down to the rail yards and done a lot of photography because it was a rich area in terms of railroads, and it was fantastic. And I was so busy building up my business and so forth, I never had time to do it. So I had to let it go, or I missed it.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm trying to catch up on some of these places, and so some of the remains of the day, so to speak, I find quite interesting. Just as I said, in Maine, for instance, there's some areas where there's some remnants of railroads that are important that I like to photograph, and I see them in a different light than I did when I was younger. So I wish there were more railroad stuff that I could photograph, but right now I'm sort of, it's not possible for me to do some of that stuff because I have to do a lot of caregiving for my wife and I can't leave her alone. But I can go back and look at my few thousand, 10,000 photographs and dig things up and look at them. And what I'd like to do is be able to do more printing of some of that work and be able to share it with the world, so to speak. because I did have a special gift of understanding light and composition. That was very important to me. And as Nevelson said, you either have it or you don't have it. And I guess I had it, so I've been able to develop it further and further. And it's not just looking at something, it's seeing it for what it is.
Actually, right on that, Newt Moore asked if you have any books you would recommend that could give people some tips on vision for light and composition and design.
Oh boy. That's a good question. I'm not so sure I can answer that particular question right off the bat. As I say, most of the stuff I learned when I was teaching. When you have that many students like I had, and trying to teach the students to see and not just look at something, and also to build. And what is composition all about? It just comes sort of naturally when you do it. That's all. It just work at it. But again, as I said, The Ongoing Moment is a very good book. And this guy can talk about that type of stuff quite well. So that's why I highly recommend it.
And I put the name and author of that in the chat for everyone.
Yes, it's The Ongoing Moment by Jeff Geoff Dyer, Dyer. And it's a paperback book. He actually was here came to Duke and gave a talk, and I went to see him and watch him here at Duke University. And I gave him a copy of The Railroad and the Art of Place. He lives in California now, and he appreciated it.
That's great.
Because in many respects, he looks at things and people and places in the art of place just like I do. So I just, Walker Evans and people like that. Read up on Walker Evans, a lot of books like that, and also Stieglitz, people like that. If you get into those books and study them for a while and look at them carefully, you can. That's the way you educate yourself. You almost have to self-educate yourself in railroad photography, as far as I'm concerned.
I would agree with that.
Any more questions on your side, Scott?
I think we've gotten through them all.
Okay. I enjoyed it. I hope they enjoyed my presentation. They can certainly contact me through you people if they have other questions. I'd be glad to answer them.
Yes, no, certainly send any questions to Haley or me, and we'll be happy to pass those on to David.
Sure.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We really appreciate David you sharing your thoughts with us. What a treat. Thank you so much for making the time for us tonight.
Oh, you're welcome. I hope everybody got something out of it, and there were enough people there who were able to watch it throughout.
No, I think we had a really good crowd. As a parting note to everyone, if anyone is looking for something to do tomorrow night, I'm actually going to be giving a presentation about railroads and art, and paintings mainly, for a group at the University of Wisconsin. And there's a sign up for that in a link I just shared. That's to the University of Wisconsin's group, and that'll be tomorrow evening, a series they do called Wednesday Nights at the Lab, starting at 7 p.m. Central Time tomorrow night. So if anyone is looking for something online tomorrow night, we can check that out. And we are planning on having another one of these in December, although we don't have that one set up yet. Stay in touch for announcements on our social media, email blast, website. We'll get information out about our next events just as soon as we get the details firmed up.
Great.
So David, thank you again. Haley, thanks for all the good work behind the scenes. We'll have a recording up of this on our YouTube site in the coming days. Certainly, thank you again, David, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
We'll see you all again soon.
Good.
Oh, our pleasure.
Thank you.